This episode is brought to you by Nebula. If you'd like to help support this channel, and First Thought, and the Deprogram, consider signing up for Nebula at the link below.
The sun. It's a big ball that can give you the power of being blind. In the immortal words of the Beatles, "It's alright." Most people have heard of the sun. As the Earth's biggest and hottest ball, it's inspired countless works of art, religions, and apps. But you might be surprised to find out that it's also caught the eye of countless economists, businessmen, and politicians. Come with me.
Graph time. Today we're talking about renewables, specifically solar energy. It comes from the sky, but it's not exactly rain. It's something else entirely, and until recently, it used to be expensive. For a long time, reducing the cost of renewables has been one of the main goals of the sustainability movement. And sure enough, here's the price of solar energy over the last 50 years. And now, here's that same information in context. Over the past half century, solar has become cheaper, in most places around the world, than oil, gas, nuclear, and even coal. And that's actually a really recent and impressive development. Coal used to be the cheapest source of energy by a lot. Even just 13 years ago, wind and solar plants were 22% and 223% more expensive than coal, respectively. This used to be because, 1, renewables were an emerging, small-scale, and therefore costly technology to both develop and implement. And 2, it came with a high upfront investment cost that takes a long time to generate an appropriate return. Think building a whole new solar farm or a field of windmills from scratch. Banks considered them a high-risk investment at that time, and generally didn't want to put money into renewables, something that they frankly didn't even care to consider given the enormous amounts of subsidies going to fossil fuels and how profitable that makes them. In the face of this lack of investment, governments had to step in. Through a combination of continuous improvements in the technology's efficiency, subsidies/market interventions by governments, notably in Germany, and a massive production effort in China generating economies of scale, solar's price per megawatt hour went down almost 90% just between 2009 and 2019, essentially doing in 10 years what NFTs managed to achieve in the 12 months of 2021. Government stepped in to stimulate investment, and now thanks to that work, solar is insanely cheap. And if you took an Econ 101 class, you know that cheap means good. Energy is energy, so the theory is that the less expensive one should attract more demand. That's what's in the eye-opening chapter of every econ book you'll read in college. And as far as climate change goes, that sounds like the problem should solve itself. So long as people do what people do and just follow the bargain, the cheaper and coincidentally more sustainable energy should take over. And seemingly in line with that positive prediction, basically every major company, even in the fossil fuel industry, from BP, Shell, and Total through massive investment firms like BlackRock and State Street, have made pledges to reduce carbon emissions and invest in renewables. Now that renewables are so cheap, it really feels like we're good to go. But we're probably not. And I know you think you know why, and you're wrong. You're expecting me to use the rest of this video to talk about the various problems with solar energy. The non-renewable rare earth minerals it requires, the horrible conditions of exploitation that are used to extract them, and the neo-colonial trade relationships that this generates. Or something like the pollution solar panel production generates and the difficulties in recycling them. Or maybe you're thinking of the problem of energy storage and day-to-day reliability we often hear about in the case against solar. But you're dumb. I'm gonna blow your tiny little pea brain to smithereens because I'm putting all these problems in our get back to it later box. This video is about something else. The thing is that even if we assumed solar energy could be a silver bullet solution to climate change, instead of looking at a more comprehensive approach, if we could set all these problems aside, there's still something that's been plaguing the renewable energy transition this whole time that low prices don't fix and might actually even hurt. They may be cheap, but renewables just aren't profitable. In May 2019, the International Energy Agency found that for the first time since the 2000s, renewable energy deployments started stagnating. For 3 years, that same agency had already found that investment in renewables was on the decline. Less money going in, fewer projects going out, despite nearly a decade of prices going down and governmental measures specifically designed to spur action. Prices had quite simply never been lower, but investment and deployment weren't following through like the conventional economic story of cheaper product wins predicts. But this is still around the same time that the fossil fuel giants, like Shell, were announcing to the public their net zero goal for 2050, which they said would be coming from a massive upscaling in renewables. But look beyond the flashy headlines, and these stats about declining investment and deployment start making more sense. Shell was actually a lot less committed to the renewable transition than they wanted to make it seem. What looked like bold, definitive statements of sustainability in the press were actually tepid, conditional half-promises that didn't commit Shell to any sustainable action whatsoever, and highlighted what matters most when private enterprise looks to invest in renewables. Specifically, Shell put 3 conditions on its transition to renewables. 1, that the society, a term that is very much not defined, would follow through on the Paris agreements. 2, that this venture would be, quote, self-funded. And most importantly, 3, Shell will only invest substantially in renewables if and only if it delivers the appropriate profits, which for Shell means an 8 to 12% return on investment.
Now, that is a business of the future, a business that doesn't really exist at this point in time. So that's why we want to move cautiously, and we will only ramp up this business as we see these proof points of an 8 to 12% return come through.
That last condition is the most important one you need to remember. The first 2 are other ways for Shell to bail out, clauses that basically amount to little more than promising to jump if they get pushed out of the plane. But that last condition, profitability, is the most crucial. Shell, and this goes for basically every other fossil fuel company that's come out with a net zero promise, places its renewable transition on the condition of a high, in this case 8 to 12%, return on investment. And the sad part is that that just won't happen. And they already know that. According to just about every estimate, no one can expect those kinds of returns on renewables. Quote, today then, solar and wind-based energy generation for the most part are not attractive investment propositions. The low cost and ready availability of renewables, as Butler observes, means few projects can make returns of more than 5 to 8%. Merchants cite similar figures for renewable project returns, which, she says, usually range from 6 to 8%. Others give even lower numbers, 4 to 6%. Shell, BP, Total, and all their little dinosaur juice friends can bask in the great press of being the good fossil fuel companies, committed to righting their wrongs and transitioning us away from fossil fuels. But behind the scenes, they know they'll never fulfill their arbitrary profit conditions, and therefore, they'll never need to keep their promise. They will not invest in renewables, and they have an out. Because, by contrast, oil and gas are still massively profitable. At the same time these net zero declarations were being made, Total was opening up new fossil fuel projects in Uganda, Angola, and Brazil. Shell, too, had 21 new projects announced all over the world, and BP successfully added 900,000 barrels of new oil and gas production a day between 2016 and 2021. Compare that to renewables. Between 2010 and mid-2018, BP only allocated 2.3% on low-carbon investment, Shell 1.3%, Chevron 0.23%, and ExxonMobil 0.22%. They are not spending their money on renewables. Actually, that's not true. A big chunk of these tiny investments actually went towards solar farms and windmills, which were used exclusively to power new oil fields, so there's always that. And fossil fuel companies aren't the only ones playing this game. BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street are commonly referred to as the Big Three in asset management. Like fossil giants, they've made the same commitments to be more sustainable. They've introduced ESG funds, and they said their requirements for these funds would become more robust in keeping with the urgency of global warming. BlackRock CEO Larry Fink has even gone out and said that, quote, no issue ranks higher than climate change. Given that together these 3 companies have north of $20 trillion in assets, control 20% of shares in the average S&P 500, and have, quote, the highest CO2 emissions from holdings in fossil fuel companies, their actions could have a huge impact on hundreds of thousands of companies and the environment. They have the wealth and massive corporate ownership to push companies across multiple high-carbon industries towards sustainability. So what do? Not that. A 2022 study of the actions of the Big Three asset management firms found that, quote, the Big Three, much more often than not, oppose rather than support shareholder resolutions aimed at improving environmental governance. Notably, this is even the case with the Big Three's environmental, social, and governance funds. a more fine-grained analysis shows that the combined voting decisions of the big three are more likely to lead to the failure than to the success of environmental resolutions, and that whether they succeed or fail, these resolutions tend to be narrow in scope and piecemeal in nature. To summarize this whole chapter, fossil fuel companies and massive firms that control entire chunks of the economy do not care about sustainability. As much as they may send out press releases or get quoted in major news outlets for saying they think the Earth is good, they are guided by one thing only: profit. It's not just greenwashing. It's not just like bad CEOs who need to be swapped out with nice CEOs. It's what the greater economic system demands. Under capitalism, production is always initiated on the basis of prospective profit. Unlike what liberal economists might tell you, it's profit, not price, that matters to our economy. Without profit, things don't happen. So while cheap solar is cool, it doesn't automatically come with the promise of change. Cheaper prices are good for consumers, but a good is only worth producing if the margins are also good for the seller. And in the world of renewables, the International Renewable Agency found in 2018 that, quote, "the margins are increasingly narrow." There's just no money to be made in renewables, and that's enough for investment and deployment to stall. More than any of the other qualms we might have with solar, it turns out this completely arbitrary limitation, the ability for a few to enrich themselves in the transition process, may actually be the biggest roadblock to a more sustainable energy production system. It's not enough that we need to release fewer greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It's not enough that it's now cheaper and easier than ever to do so. It will not happen unless someone finds a way to make money off it. And that's just sad. And do you want to know how I know this transition won't happen just because of cheap solar prices? Beyond all the evidence I just cited of what companies are doing right now, the reason the transition to renewables isn't happening is because of one incredibly simple word: exploitation.
Okay, folks, we are going on a detour. I'm about to summarize this book way too quickly. To understand our predicament with transitioning from fossil fuels to renewables, we can look at how we transitioned power sources during the Industrial Revolution. Back then, we went from water power to steam power, meaning we started using fossil fuel combustion to power stuff. While flowing water and fossil fuels each had their own advantages, the main one for fossil fuel power was that you can use it to make a box of fire, and it'll make a train move. But that's about it. In the competition of who was going to power factories, water and coal were equivalent options. Except that water was cheaper. Unlike coal, water takes very little human labor to extract energy from. And given that it could produce as much power as steam, that waterfalls were abundant, and that it was cheaper, if we are to trust liberal economists, history should be that steam, and therefore fossil fuels, would only have limited applications in things like transportation. But overall, water should have dominated industrial production. But that's not what happened, because right after I finished saying that sentence, cities all over Britain started filling up with black smoke. My bad. That's because the thing that differentiated steam and water was that steam was better for exploiting humans. And therefore, although water was a cheaper source of energy, it was a less profitable one. One, flowing water sources are pretty often out in the countryside. If you want to use them, you often need to bring people to the water. And if those people you moved closer to the water strike, it's hard to find scabs to replace them out in the boonies. Fossil fuels, however, can be brought into the cities, where a massive population of recently impoverished people are already there, and they're desperate for work now that the enclosures have cut them off community-managed farms. Abundant city workers are more exploitable than scarce countryside workers. 2, water has its own rhythm. Sometimes it doesn't flow, and therefore people don't work. In the city, though, as long as you keep shoveling coal, you can work through the night, every day of the week, for as long as you can get people to stay in the factory. The only limit on exploitation is the amount of people and the amount of coal, and there was plenty of both. Lastly, water's hard to collect and privatize. A coal mine, or an oil well, is fundamentally just a hole in the ground surrounded by guns. It's easy to claim as your own, and to enforce that claim with violence in a way that is much harder with a naturally occurring water source that can run for miles. And if you're thinking about building a reservoir, well, that gets a little too community project-y for privatization. Altogether, this meant that even though water was cheaper, it was less profitable as a source of energy. Fossil fuels, coal specifically, was fantastic for the burgeoning capitalist class, not because they were cheaper, but because they were an excellent source of surplus value. Okay, detour over.
See, I told you we'd come back to this. The reason I took that massive detour is not only that it reiterates this video's main point, which is that under capitalism, profit matters, not price, but it's actually also giving us a bit of insight into what's happening with renewables right now. In this video, you've heard me say over and over again that renewables aren't profitable, and that's not exactly true. Providing renewable energy isn't profitable. Since governments have slowly stopped guaranteeing high prices to renewable energy providers, something you won't be surprised to find out that the fossil fuel industry lobbies for, the efficiency race, which is good for all of us, has been bad for those trying to extract a profit. They used to be able to generate electricity for cheap and sell it for expensive. And now they can't do that anymore, which has driven them out of the energy providing game. Basically, the strategy of creating a competitive capitalist market that countries like Germany undertook worked too well, to the point that the margins don't justify the investment anymore. Capitalism always requires monopoly and strategic inefficiency to extract profit, to the detriment of the rest of us. Competition is often the enemy, and right now, that makes solar energy provision a bad venture. This isn't helped by the fact that, like water power, solar energy is harder to gatekeep than fossil fuel energy. You need relatively few guns to protect a small oil well that generates barrels of electricity, compared to a big solar farm that can do the same but needs a lot more guns. So, where's the money going? All these places keep divesting from fossil fuels, there is investment in renewables, even if it is stagnating, and ESG funds seem to do well. So, where is that? The truth is that money goes to the parts of the process where exploitation is still rampant and guaranteed. Basically, manufacturing solar technology and extracting rare earth minerals from the ground in countries in the periphery. In other words, the parts of the solar business that are still incredibly ugly to look at because they are either rife with violence or places where pollution isn't a cost companies need to worry about. That's where privatization is easy, where labor is cheap, and where the margins are therefore still high. Where exploitation is still possible. That's where the money goes. And before this seems like another path to the same solution, a less carbon-intensive economy, nothing about this ugliness is intrinsic to solar. Mining these resources doesn't need to be violent like it is, or nearly as polluting, or need to happen on such a large scale. If we simply allocate energy effectively and break the requirement of constant, unending economic growth, we'll need way less of this stuff. If workers weren't so disempowered, they wouldn't have to accept these awful conditions that produce such great profit margins. If democratic bodies could enforce environmental stewardship norms, the quick and dirty pollution of the mining process could be kept under control. It is only when growth and exploitation, and therefore profit, is a requirement for sustainable action that this ugliness sticks around. And it is only because it is there and hasn't been purged by collective social action that capitalists make a profit. Bottom line, solar and renewable energy generally will probably need to be a part of how we limit the worst of climate change. But so long as moving in this direction requires us to find profit in the process, it will continue to come with massive drawbacks. It will place the burden of remaining within our planetary boundaries on the most exploited people in the world, and will not come soon enough to save us all, only the most fortunate. That is unacceptable. There is no capitalist path to climate justice. I mentioned at the beginning of the video that this channel is supported by Nebula, but what you might not know is that you can also find First Thought and the Deprogram on Nebula too. I've gotten a bunch of requests to host them both on the platform, so I hope you're excited to see them added to the roster. If you'd like to help support projects like these, the best possible way you can do that is by signing up for Nebula at the link below. Nebula is home to content from all your favorite creators, and it's a place where we can experiment and produce the content we really want to make, without the fear of age restriction or demonetization. If you've ever listened to the Deprogram, you understand why it's always demonetized. That's why I'm so glad we have Nebula. We can be honest, we can have fun, we can produce content for people to enjoy without having to choose our words carefully to avoid age restriction or demonetization. And now, if you sign up with my link, you'll also get access to the new Nebula classes, where creators host classes on how to be a creator. There's something for everyone, and it's another way for you to take a peek behind the scenes and see what really goes into making content. Your favorite creators teaching you how to create. In my opinion, that's pretty cool. Here's the heartfelt part. Every person who signs up using my link is directly contributing to the financial stability of this operation. That's Second Thought, the Deprogram, and First Thought. None of this would be possible without the generosity of viewers like you, especially since pretty much all my sponsors have bailed. And it doesn't take a huge investment to help keep the lights on. If you sign up with the link below, you'll get access to Nebula and Nebula classes for under $3 a month. With my link, the annual plan is just $30 a year, or $2.50 a month. I honestly think that's an amazing deal for all the great content on Nebula. So if you'd like to help support my work, and get access to the streaming platform built and owned by the creators, sign up for Nebula using my link below. It really does help support me and educational creators all across YouTube. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can watch my other content by following the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.